If you want to know how powerful of a painter William Brice would become, you can see it as far back as the late 1940s. If you look at this painting from 1947, you see this almost a kind of radiant aura about these rocks. But when you look at their shapes, they all look extremely biomorphic. They look like biological specimens rather than mineral specimens. They almost look like living creatures. And the way these stones collect themselves, it's as if they're behaving relative to one another, as if they're in some kind of a dramatic situation. There's an aspect of time that pervades a lot of Bill Brice's art, but you can see it here also in this early example, these rock formations. There is, first of all, kind of a suggestion of natural history. To get them this worn, to get them this smooth, requires a lot of time. But for me, there's also an aspect of timelessness to these paintings. Everything seems frozen and fixed in space to be this way for eternity. When I look at this, I think of the stillness, the quietude of a still life by, say, Morandi, or the almost kind of metaphysical stillness that you would see in a Zurbaran painting, where things are just fixed forever. It's like a condition rather than an arrangement that is being painted here. I have written about these paintings as being a kind of psychodrama. And you think, well, you know, what could be more lifeless than a stone? But look at this and you can see how really alive these voluptuous shapes are. Look at how they respond to one another. Some of them are reclining, leaning next to each other, almost as if they were in some kind of a bodily caress. Brice anthropomorphized these stones. He's given them almost a kind of haunting, phantom-like personality. And that Brice could pull this off, I think, is a real testimony to his imagination and to the way it compels the viewer's imagination. And incidentally, I would say that it's not, my reading of this is not the product of my own hyper imagination here. It's all there in the painting. It was put there by the artist. Brice's fascination with stones, litho as a medium, so to speak, a conceptual medium, continues later on in his career. In 1970, he and the family took a trip to Greece, and littering the landscape were fragments from classical civilization. There was not only architecture and architectural elements such as columns strewn all about the land, but there were fragments of statuary. Body parts lay around in the landscape. It's really amazing to see how much that fascinated the artist, the contemporary artist, but once more we find that he's turning to the stone for its psychological attraction to him, but this matching, this union of architecture and stone and the flesh becomes the basis for a whole chapter of his signature style, his most mature style that we think of when we think Bill Brice. And as in the past, there is a strong sexual element here. You can read, the sexuality just outright. These are not about sexual union. It's not about intercourse. It's not about specific sexual activity, but it's about eroticism itself. And yet, it's done as if it were a pictogram or a hieroglyph. It's not an outright depiction of anything, not even really, certainly not accurately, of the human body. What does it depict? Nothing. And yet everybody knows exactly what these pictures are about. We know what it's about, and yet he doesn't say it directly or quite willingly. I think for some artists in the 1960s and the 1970s, and I'm thinking especially of the minimalists, Their notion of art was that it should not depict anything except itself. It should not be about anything that happens in the studio except the manufacture and the presence of that object as we, the viewer, encounter it. They were literalists of the most supreme kind. They were cemented to the idea of the real. I don't think Bill Brice was a minimalist in any cell of his body. I think he believed in the beauty of imagining things. I believe he believed in the irreality of art. Maybe that's why he looked so often, so consistently to the past. A time that really existed, but which we can only imagine. We can only try to assign or ascribe attributes to it from the evidence that we have. And it occurs to me that looking at the past is quite analogous to the way we live our lives, our real lives, our own lives in the present. We imagine what we want to. We may have to make some concessions to circumstance and to reality and things that really exist all around us, but how we position ourselves, how we have our own individual understandings of what does it mean to be me, or whoever you might be. What does it mean to be that person in real life? It's an act of imagination. I think for William Brice, making art and living life must have been co-equals. And leaving the studio door closed doesn't mean he didn't take all that baggage with him into real life, and going into the studio and closing the door behind him didn't mean that he left his other life on the outside of that door. They come together pretty strongly.